The Ghost Pirates. Chapter 8. After the Coming of the Mist. After the coming of the mist, things seemed to develop pretty quickly. In the following 2 or 3 days, a good deal happened. On the night of the day on which the skipper had sent me away from the wheel, it was our watch on deck from 8 o'clock to 12, and my lookout from 10 to 12. As I paced slowly to and fro across the forecastle head, I was thinking about the affair of the morning. At first, my thoughts were about the old man. I cursed him thoroughly to myself for being a pig-headed old fool, until it occurred to me that if I had been in his place and come on deck to find the ship almost aback, and the fellow at the wheel staring out across the sea instead of attending to his business, I should most certainly have kicked up a thundering row. And then I had been an ass to tell him about the ship. I should never have done such a thing if I had not been a bit adrift. Most likely the old chap thought I was cracked. I ceased to bother my head about him, and fell to wondering why the second mate had looked at me so queerly in the morning. Did he guess more of the truth than I supposed? And if that were the case, why had he refused to listen to me? After that, I went to puzzling about the mist. I had thought a great deal about it during the day. One idea appealed to me very strongly. It was that the actual visible mist was a materialized expression of an extraordinarily subtle atmosphere in which we were moving. Abruptly, as I walked backwards and forwards, taking occasional glances over the sea, which was almost calm, my eye caught the glow of a light out in the darkness. I stood still and stared. I wondered whether it was the light of a vessel. In that case, we were no longer enveloped in that extraordinary atmosphere. I bent forward and gave the thing my more immediate attention. I saw then that it was undoubtedly the green light of a vessel on our port bow. It was plain that she was bent on crossing our bows. What was more, she was dangerously near. The size and brightness of her light showed that. She would be close-hauled, while we were going free, so that of course it was our place to get out of her way. Instantly I turned, and putting my hands up to my mouth, hailed the second mate. "Light on the port bow, sir." The next moment his hail came back. "Whereabouts?" He must be blind, I said to myself. "About 2 points on the bow, sir," I sung out. Then I turned to see whether she had shifted her position at all. Yet when I came to look, there was no light visible. I ran forward to the bows and leant over the rail and stared, but there was nothing, absolutely nothing, except the darkness all about us. For perhaps a few seconds I stood thus, and a suspicion swept across me that the whole business was practically a repetition of the affair of the morning. Evidently, the impalpable something that invested the ship had thinned for an instant, thus allowing me to see the light ahead. Now it had closed again. Yet whether I could see or not, I did not doubt the fact that there was a vessel ahead, and very close ahead too. We might run on top of her any minute. My only hope was that, seeing we were not getting out of her way, she had put her helm up so as to let us pass, with the intention of then crossing under our stern. I waited pretty anxiously, watching and listening. Then, all at once, I heard steps coming along the deck forward, and the 'prentice, whose timekeeping it was, came up on the forecastle head. "The second mate says he can't see any light, Jessup," he said, coming over to where I stood. "Whereabouts is it?" "I don't know," I answered. "I've lost sight of it myself. It was a green light, about a couple of points on the port bow. It seemed fairly close." "Perhaps their lamp's gone out," he suggested, after peering out pretty hard into the night for a minute or so. "Perhaps," I said. I did not tell him that the light had been so close that, even in the darkness, we should now have been able to see the ship herself. "You're quite sure it was a light and not a star?" he asked doubtfully after another long stare. "Oh, no," I said. "It may have been the moon, now I come to think about it." "Don't rot," he replied. "It's easy enough to make a mistake. What shall I say to the second mate?" "Tell him it's disappeared, of course." "Where to?" he asked. "How the devil should I know?" I told him. "Don't ask silly questions." "All right, keep your rag in," he said, and went aft to report to the second mate. 5 minutes later, it might have been, I saw the light again. It was broad on the bow, and told me plainly enough that she had up with her helm to escape being run down. I did not wait a moment, but sung out to the second mate that there was a green light about 4 points on the port bow. By Jove, it must have been a close shave. The light did not seem to be more than 100 yards away. It was fortunate that we had not much way through the water. Now, I thought to myself, the second will see the thing, and perhaps Mr. Blooming Prentice will be able to give the star its proper name. Even as the thought came into my head, the light faded and vanished, and I caught the second mate's voice. "Where away?" he was singing out. "It's gone again, sir," I answered. A minute later, I'd heard him coming along the deck. He reached the foot of the starboard ladder. "Where are you, Jessup?" he inquired. "Here, sir," I said, and went to the top of the weather ladder. He came up slowly onto the forecastle head. "What's this you've been singing out about a light?" he asked. "Just point out exactly where it was you last saw it." This I did, and he went over to the port rail and stared away into the night, but without seeing anything. "It's gone, sir," I ventured to remind him, "though I've seen it twice now, once about a couple of points on the bow, and this last time broad away on the bow, but it disappeared both times almost at once." "I don't understand it at all, Jessup," he said in a puzzled voice. "Are you sure it was a ship's light?" "Yes, sir, a green light. It was quite close." "I don't understand," he said again. "Run aft and ask the prentice to pass you down my night glasses. Be as smart as you can." "Aye, aye, sir," I replied, and ran aft. In less than a minute I was back with his binoculars, and with them he stared for some time at the sea to leeward. All at once he dropped them to his side and faced round on me with a sudden question. "Where's she gone to? If she shifted her bearing as quickly as all that, she must be precious close. We should be able to see her spars and sails, or her cabin light, or her binnacle light, or something." "It's queer, sir," I assented. "Damned queer," he said. "So damned queer that I'm inclined to think you've made a mistake." "No, sir, I'm certain it was a light." "Where's the ship, then?" he asked. "I can't say, sir. That's just what's been puzzling me." The second said nothing in reply, but took a couple of quick turns across the forecastle head, stopping at the port rail and taking another look to leeward through his night glasses. Perhaps a minute he stood there. Then, without a word, he went down the lee ladder and away aft along the main deck to the poop. "He's jolly well puzzled," I thought to myself, "or else he thinks I've been imagining things. Either way, I guessed he'd think that." In a little I began to wonder whether, after all, he had any idea of what might be the truth. One minute I would feel certain he had, and the next I was just as sure that he guessed nothing. I got one of my fits of asking myself whether it would not have been better to have told him everything. It seemed to me that he must have seen sufficient to make him inclined to listen to me, and yet I could not by any means be certain. I might only have been making an ass of myself in his eyes, or set him thinking I was dotty. I was walking about the forecastle head, feeling like this, when I saw the light for the third time. It was very bright and big, and I could see it move, as I watched. This again showed me that it must be very close. Surely, I thought, the second mate must see it now for himself. I did not sing out this time right away. I thought I would let the second see for himself that I had not been mistaken. Besides, I was not going to risk its vanishing again the instant I had spoken. For quite half a minute I watched it, and there was no sign of its disappearing. Every moment I expected to hear the second mate's hail, showing that he had spotted it at last, but none came. I could stand it no longer, and I ran to the rail on the after part of the forecastle head. "Green light a little abaft the beam, sir," I hung out at the top of my voice. But I had waited too long. Even as I shouted, the light blurred and vanished. I stamped my foot and swore. The thing was making a fool of me. Yet I had a faint hope that those aft had seen it just before it disappeared. But this I knew was vain. Directly I heard the second's voice. "Light be damned!" he shouted. Then he blew his whistle, and one of the men ran aft, out of the forecastle, to see what it was he wanted. "Whose next lookout is it?" I heard him ask. "Jasket, sir." "Then tell Jasket to relieve Jessup at once. Do you hear?" "Yes, sir," said the man, and came forward. In a minute Jasket stumbled up onto the forecastle head. "What's up, mate?" he asked sleepily. "It's that fool of a second mate," I said savagely. "I've reported a light to him 3 times, and because the blind fool can't see it, he sent you up to relieve me." "Where is it, mate?" he inquired. He looked round at the dark sea. "I don't see no light," he remarked after a few moments. "No," I said, "it's gone." "Eh?" he inquired. "It's gone," I repeated irritably. He turned and regarded me silently through the dark. "I'd go and have a sleep, mate," he said at length. "I been that way myself. There's nothing like a snooze when yer gets like that." "What?" I said. "Like what?" "It's all right, mate. You'll be all right in the morning. Don't you worry about me." His tone was sympathetic. "Hell," was all I said, and walked down off the forecastle head. I wondered whether the old fellow thought I was going silly. "Have a sleep, by Jove," I muttered to myself. "I wonder who'd feel like having a sleep after what I've seen and stood today." I felt rotten, with no one understanding what was really the matter. I seemed to be all alone, through the things I had learnt. Then the thought came to me to go aft and talk the matter over with Tammy. I knew he would be able to understand, of course, and it would be such a relief. On the impulse, I turned and went aft, along the deck to the prentice's berth. As I neared the break of the poop, I looked up and saw the dark shape of the second mate leaning over the rail above me. "Who's that?" he asked. "It's Jessup, sir," I said. "What do you want in this part of the ship?" he inquired. "I'd come aft to speak to Tammy, sir," I replied. "You go along forward and turn in," he said, not altogether unkindly. "A sleep will do you more good than yarning about. You know, you're getting to fancy things too much." "I'm sure I'm not, sir. I'm perfectly well. That will do," he interrupted sharply. "You go and have a sleep." I gave a short curse under my breath and went slowly forward. I was getting maddened with being treated as if I were not quite sane. "By God," I said to myself, "wait till the fools know what I know. Just wait." I entered the forecastle through the port doorway and went across to my chest and sat down. I felt angry and tired and miserable. Quoin and Plummer were sitting close by, playing cards and smoking. Stubbins lay in his bunk watching them and also smoking. As I sat down, he put his head forward over the bunk-board and regarded me in a curious, meditative way. "What's up with their second officer?" he asked after a short stare. I looked at him, and the other 2 men looked up at me. I felt I should go off with a bang, if I did not say something, and let out pretty stiffly, telling them the whole business. Yet I had seen enough to know that it was no good trying to explain things, so I just told them the plain, bold facts and left explanations as much alone as possible. "3 times, you say?" said Stubbins when I had finished. "Yes," I assented. And their old men sent you from their wheel this morning 'cause you happened to see a ship he couldn't," Plummer added in a reflective tone. "Yes," I said again. I thought I saw him look at Quoin significantly, but Stubbins, I noticed, looked only at me. "I reckon their second thinks you're a bit off colour," he remarked after a short pause. "The second mate's a fool," I said, with some bitterness. "A confounded fool." "I ain't so sure about that," he replied. "It's bound ter seem queer to him. I don't understand it myself." He lapsed into silence and smoked. "I can't understand how it is their second mate didn't happen to spot it," Quoin said in a puzzled voice. It seemed to me that Plummer nudged him to be quiet. It looked as if Plummer shared the second mate's opinion, and the idea made me savage. But Stubbins's next remark drew my attention. "I don't understand it," he said again, speaking with deliberation. "All the same, their second should have savvied enough not to have slung you off their lookout." He nodded his head slowly, keeping his gaze fixed on my face. "How do you mean?" I asked, puzzled, yet with a vague sense that the man understood more, perhaps, than I had hitherto thought. "I mean, what's their second so blessed cocksure about?" He took a draw at his pipe, removed it, and leant forward somewhat over his bunk-board. "Didn't he say nothing ter you after you came hoff the lookout?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "He spotted me going aft. He told me I was getting to imagining things too much. He said I'd better come forward and get a sleep." "And what did you say?" "Nothing. I came forward." "Why didn't you bloomin' well harsk him if he weren't doing their imagining trick when he sent us chasing up their main, after that bogeyman of his?" "I never thought of it," I told him. "Well, you ought to have." He paused and sat up in his bunk and asked for a match. As I passed him my box, Quoin looked up from his game. "It might have been a stowaway, you know. You can't say it's ever been proved as it wasn't." Stubbins passed the box back to me and went on without noticing Quoin's remark. "Told you to go and have a snooze, did he? I don't understand what he's bluffing at." "How do you mean, bluffing?" I asked. He nodded his head sagely. "It's my idea he knows you saw that light just as bloomin' well as I do." Plummer looked up from his game at this speech, but said nothing. "Then you don't doubt that I really saw it?" I asked with a certain surprise. "Not me," he remarked with assurance. "You ain't likely to make that kind of mistake 3 times running." "No," I said. "I know I saw the light right enough. But—" I hesitated a moment. "It's blessed queer." "It is blessed queer," he agreed. "It's damned queer. And there's a lot of other damn queer things happening aboard this packet lately." He was silent for a few seconds. Then he spoke suddenly. "It's not natural. I'm damn sure of that much." He took a couple of draws at his pipe, and in the momentary silence I caught Jaskett's voice above us. He was hailing the poop. "Red light on the starboard quarter, sir," I heard him sing out. "There you are," I said with a jerk of my head. "That's about where that packet I spotted ought to be by now. She couldn't cross our bows, so she up-helm and let us pass, and now she's hauled up again and gone under our stern." I got up from the chest and went to the door, the other 3 following. As we stepped out on deck, I heard the second mate shouting out, away aft, to know the whereabouts of the light. "By Jove, Stubbins," I said, "I believe the blessed thing's gone again." We ran to the starboard side in a body and looked over, but there was no sign of a light in the darkness astern. "I can't say as I see any light," said Quoin. Plummer said nothing. I looked up at the forecastle head. There I could faintly distinguish the outlines of Jaskett. He was standing by the starboard rail, with his hands up, shading his eyes, evidently staring towards the place where he had last seen the light. "Where's she got to, Jaskett?" I called out. "I can't say, mate," he answered. It's the most hellishly funny thing I've ever comed across. She were there as plain as me at one minute, and the next she were gone, clean gone." I turned to Plummer. "What do you think about it now?" I asked him. "Well," he said, "I'll admit I thought at first 'twere something and nothing. I thought you was mistaken, but it seems you did see something." Away aft we heard the sound of steps along the deck. "The second's coming forward for a hexplanation, Jasket," Stubbins sung out. "You better go down and change your breeks." The second mate passed us and went up the starboard ladder. "What's up now, Jasket?" he said quickly. "Where is this light? Neither the 'prentice nor I can see it." "The damn thing's clean gone, sir," Jasket replied. "Gone," the second mate said. "Gone? What do you mean?" "She were there one minute, sir, as plain as me at, and the next she's gone." "That's a damn silly yarn to tell me," the second replied. "You don't expect me to believe it, do you?" "It's gospel truth anyhow, sir," Jasket answered, "and Jessup seen it just the same." He seemed to have added that last part as an afterthought. Evidently the old beggar had changed his opinion as to my need for sleep. "You're an old fool, Jasket," the second said sharply, "and that idiot Jessup has been putting things into your silly old head." He paused an instant. Then he continued, "What the devil's the matter with you all, that you've taken to this sort of game? You know very well that you saw no light. I sent Jessup off the lookout, and then you must go and start the same game." "We haven't," Jasket started to say, but the second silenced him. "Stow it," he said, and turned and went down the ladder, passing us quickly without a word. "Doesn't look to me, Stubbins," I said, as though the second did believe we've seen the light. "I ain't so sure," he answered. "He's a puzzler." The rest of the watch passed away quietly, and at 8 bells I made haste to turn in, for I was tremendously tired. When we were called again for the 4 to 8 watch on deck, I learnt that one of the men in the mate's watch had seen a light soon after we had gone below, and had reported it, only for it to disappear immediately. This, I found, had happened twice, and the mate had got so wild, being under the impression that the man was playing the fool, that he had nearly come to blows with him, finally ordering him off the lookout and sending another man up in his place. If this last man saw the light, he took good care not to let the mate know, so that the matter had ended there. And then, on the following night, before we had ceased to talk about the matter of the vanishing lights, something else occurred that temporarily drove from my mind all memory of the mist, and the extraordinary, blind atmosphere it seemed to usher. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The Man Who Cried for Help. It was, as I have said, on the following night that something further happened, and it brought home pretty vividly to me, if not to any of the others, the sense of a personal danger aboard. We had gone below for the 8 to 12 watch, and my last impression of the weather at 8 o'clock was that the wind was freshening. There had been a great bank of cloud rising astern, which had looked as if it were going to breeze up still more. At 11:45, when we were called for our 12 to 4 watch on deck, I could tell at once, by the sound, that there was a fresh breeze blowing. At the same time, I heard the voices of the men on the other watch singing out as they hauled on the ropes. I caught the little of canvas in the wind and guessed that they were taking the royals off her. I looked at my watch, which I always kept hanging in my bunk. It showed the time to be just after the quarter, so that, with luck, we should escape having to go up to the sails. I dressed quickly, and then went to the door to look at the weather. I found that the wind had shifted from the starboard quarter to right aft, and, by the look of the sky, there seemed to be a promise of more before long. Up aloft, I could make out faintly the fore and mizzen royals flapping in the wind. The main had been left for a while longer. In the fore riggings, Jacobs, the ordinary seaman in the mate's watch, was following another of the men aloft to the sail. The mate's 2 prentices were already up at the mizzen. Down on deck, the rest of the men were busy clearing up the ropes. I went back to my bunk and looked at my watch. The time was only a few minutes off 8 bells, so I got my oilskins ready, for it looked like rain outside. As I was doing this, Jock went to the door for a look. "What's it doing, Jock?" Tom asked, getting out of his bunk hurriedly. "I'm thinking maybe it's going to blow a wee, and you'll be needing your oilskins," Jock answered. When 8 bells went, and we mustered aft for roll call, there was a considerable delay, owing to the mate refusing to call the roll, until Tom, who, as usual, had only turned out of his bunk at the last minute, came aft to answer his name. When at last he did come, the second and the mate joined in giving him a good dressing down for a lazy soldier, so that several minutes passed before we were on our way forward again. This was a small enough matter in itself, and yet really terrible in its consequence to one of our number, for just as we reached the fore-rigging, there was a shout aloft, loud above the noise of the wind, and the next moment something crashed down into our midst, with a great slogging thud, something bulky and weighty that struck full upon Jock, so that he went down with a loud, horrible, ringing ugh, and never said a word. From the whole crowd of us there went up a yell of fear, and then, with one accord, there was a run for the lighted forecastle. I am not ashamed to say that I ran with the rest. A blind, unreasoning fright had seized me, and I did not stop to think. Once in the forecastle and the light, there was a reaction. We all stood and looked blankly at one another for a few moments. Then someone asked a question, and there was a general murmur of denial. We all felt ashamed, and someone reached up and unhooked the lantern on the port side. I did the same with the starboard one, and there was a quick movement towards the doors. As we streamed out on deck, I caught the sound of the mates' voices. They had evidently come down off the poop to find out what had happened, but it was too dark to see their whereabouts. "Where the hell have you all got to?" I heard the mate shout. The next instant they must have seen the light from our lanterns, for I heard their footsteps coming along the deck at a run. They came the starboard side, and just abaft the fore-rigging. One of them stumbled and fell over something. It was the first mate who had tripped. I knew this by the cursing that came directly afterwards. He picked himself up, and apparently, without stopping to see what manner of thing it was that he had fallen over, made a rush to the pin-rail. The second mate ran into the circle of light thrown by our lanterns and stopped dead, eyeing us doubtfully. I am not surprised at this now, nor at the behavior of the mate, the following instant. But at that time, I must say, I could not conceive what had come to them, particularly the first mate. He came out at us from the darkness with a rush and a roar like a bull, and brandishing a belaying pin. I had failed to take into account the scene which his eyes must have shown him. The whole crowd of men in the forecastle, both watches, pouring out onto the deck in utter confusion and greatly excited, with a couple of fellows at their head carrying lanterns. And before this there had been the cry aloft and the crash down on deck, followed by the shouts of the frightened crew and the sounds of many feet running. He may well have taken the cry for a signal, and our actions for something not far short of mutiny. Indeed, his words told us that this was his very thought. "I'll knock the face off the first man that comes a step further aft," he shouted, shaking the pin in my face. "I'll show you who's master here. What the hell do you mean by this? Get forward into your kennel." There was a low growl from the men at the last remark, and the old bully stepped back a couple of paces. "Hold on, you fellows," I sung out. "Shut up a minute." "Mr. Tulipson," I called out to the second, who had not been able to get a word in edgeways. "I don't know what the devil's the matter with the first mate, but he'll not find it pay to talk to a crowd like ours in that sort of fashion, or there'll be ructions aboard." Come, Jessup, this won't do. I can't have you talking like that about the mate," he said sharply. "Let me know what's to do, and then go forward again, the lot of you." "We'd have told you at first, sir," I said, "only the mate wouldn't give any of us a chance to speak. There's been an awful accident, sir. Something's fallen from aloft, right onto Jock." I stopped suddenly, for there was a loud crying aloft. "Help! Help! Help!" someone was shouting, and then it rose from a shout to a scream. "My God, sir," I shouted, "that's one of the men up in the fore royal." "Listen," ordered the second mate. "Listen." Even as he spoke, it came again, broken and, as it were, in gasps. "Help! Oh, God! Oh, help! Help!" Abruptly, Stubbins' voice struck in. "Hup with us, lads! By God, hup with us!" And he made a spring into the fore rigging. I shoved that handle of the lantern between my teeth and followed. Plummer was coming, but the second mate pulled him back. "That's sufficient," he said. "I'm going," and he came up after me. We went over the foretop, racing like fiends. The light from the lantern prevented me from seeing to any distance in the darkness, but at the crosstrees, Stubbins, who was some ratlines ahead, shouted out all at once and in gasps, "They're fightin' like hell!" "What?" called the second mate breathlessly. Apparently, Stubbins did not hear him, for he made no reply. We cleared the crosstrees and climbed into the topgallant rigging. The wind was fairly fresh up there, and overhead there sounded the flap-flap of sailcloth flying in the wind. But since we had left the deck, there had been no other sound from above. Now, abruptly, there came again a wild crying from the darkness over us. A strange, wild medley it was of screams for help, mixed up with violent, breathless curses. Beneath the royal yard, Stubbins halted and looked down to me. "Hurry up with their lantern, Jessup," he shouted, catching his breath between the words. "There'll be murder done in a minute." I reached him and held the light up for him to catch. He stooped and took it from me. Then, holding it above his head, he went a few ratlines higher. In this manner he reached to a level with the royal yard. From my position a little below him, the lantern seemed but to throw a few straggling, flickering rays along the spar, yet they showed me something. My first glance had been to windward, and I had seen at once that there was nothing on the weather yard arm. From there my gaze went to leeward. Indistinctly I saw something upon the yard that clung, struggling. Stubbins bent towards it with the light. Thus I saw it more clearly. It was Jacobs, the ordinary seaman. He had his right arm tightly round the yard. With the other, he appeared to be fending himself from something on the other side of him and further out upon the yard. At times, moans and gasps came from him, and sometimes curses. Once, as he appeared to be dragged partly from his hold, he screamed like a woman. His whole attitude suggested stubborn despair. I can scarcely tell you how this extraordinary sight affected me. I seemed to stare at it without realizing that the affair was a real happening. During the few seconds which I had spent staring and breathless, Stubbins had climbed round the after side of the mast, and now I began again to follow him. From his position below me, the second had not been able to see the thing that was occurring on the yard, and he sung out to me to know what was happening. "It's Jacob, sir," I called back. "He seems to be fighting with someone to leeward of him. I can't see very plainly yet." Stubbins had got round onto the lee foot-rope, and now he held the lantern up, peering, and I made my way quickly alongside of him. The second mate followed, but instead of getting down onto the foot-rope, he got onto the yard, and stood there holding on to the tie. He sung out for one of us to pass him up the lantern, which I did, Stubbins handing it to me. The second held it out at arm's length, so that it lit up the lee part of the yard. The light showed through the darkness, so far as to where Jacob struggled so weirdly. Beyond him, nothing was distinct. There had been a moment's delay while we were passing the lantern up to the second mate. Now, however, Stubbins and I moved out slowly along the foot-rope. We went slowly, but we did well to go at all, with any show of boldness, for the whole business was so abominably uncanny. It seems impossible to convey truly to you the strange scene on the royal yard. You may be able to picture it yourselves. the second mate standing upon the spar, holding the lantern, his body swaying with each roll of the ship, and his head craned forward as he peered along the yard. On our left, Jacobs, mad, fighting, cursing, praying, gasping, and outside of him, shadows and the night. The second mate spoke abruptly. "Hold on a moment," he said. Then, "Jacobs," he shouted. "Jacobs, do you hear me?" There was no reply, only the continual gasping and cursing. "Go on," the second mate said to us. "But be careful. Keep a tight hold." He held the lantern higher, and we went out cautiously. Stubben reached the ordinary and put his hand on his shoulder with a soothing gesture. "Steady on now, Jacobs," he said. "Steady on." At his touch, as though by magic, the young fellow calmed down, and Stubbins, reaching round him, grasped the jackstay on the other side. "Get a hold of him on your side, Jessup," he sung out. "I'll get this side." This I did, and Stubbins climbed round him. "There ain't no one here," Stubbins called to me, but his voice expressed no surprise. "What?" sung out the second mate. "No one there? Where's Svensson, then?" I did not catch Stubbins's reply, for suddenly it seemed to me that I saw something shadowy at the extreme end of the yard out by the lift. I stared. It rose up on the yard, and I saw that it was the figure of a man. It grasped at the lift and commenced to swarm up quickly. It passed diagonally above Stubbins's head and reached down a vague hand and arm. "Look out, Stubbins!" I shouted. "Look out!" "What's up now?" he called in a startled voice. At the same instant his cap went whirling away to leeward. "Damn the wind!" he burst out. Then all at once Jacobs, who had only been giving an occasional moan, commenced to shriek and struggle. "Hold fast on to him," Stubbins yelled. "He'll be throwing himself off the yard." I put my left arm around the ordinary's body, getting hold of the jackstay on the other side. Then I looked up. Above us, I seemed to see something dark and indistinct that moved rapidly up the lift. "Get tight hold of him while I get a gasket," I heard the second mate sing out. A moment later there was a crash, and the light disappeared. "Damn and set fire to the sail!" shouted the second mate. I twisted round somewhat and looked in his direction. I could dimly make him out on the yard. He had evidently been in the act of getting down onto the foot-rope when the lantern was smashed. From him my gaze jumped to the lee rigging. It seemed that I made out some shadowy thing stealing down through the darkness, but I could not be sure. And then, in a breath, it had gone. "Anything wrong, sir?" I called out. "Yes," he answered. "I've dropped the lantern. The blessed sail knocked it out of my hand." "We'll be all right, sir," I replied. "I think we can manage without it. Jacob seems to be quieter now." "Well, be careful as you come in," he warned us. "Come on, Jacobs," I said. "Come on, we'll go down on deck." "Go along, young feller," Stubbins put in. "You're right now. We'll take care of you." And we started to guide him along the yard. He went willingly enough, though without saying a word. He seemed like a child. Once or twice he shivered, but said nothing. We got him into the lee rigging. Then, one going beside him and the other keeping below, we made our way slowly down on deck. We went very slowly, so slowly, in fact, that the second mate, who had stayed a minute to shove the gasket round the lee side of the sail, was almost as soon down. "Take Jacobs forward to his bunk," he said, and went away aft to where a crowd of the men, one with a lantern, stood round the door of an empty berth under the break of the poop on the starboard side. We hurried forward to the forecastle. There we found all in darkness. "They're aft with Jock and Svensson." Stubbins had hesitated an instant before saying the name. "Yes," I replied. "That's what it must have been, right enough." "I kind of knew it all the time," he said. I stepped in through the doorway and struck a match. Stubbins followed, guiding Jacobs before him, and together we got him into his bunk. We covered him up with his blankets, for he was pretty shivery. Then we came out. During the whole time he had not spoken a word. As we went aft, Stubbins remarked that he thought the business must have made him a bit dotty. "It's driven him clean barmy," he went on. "He don't understand a word that's said to him." "He may be different in the morning," I answered. As we neared the poop and the crowd of waiting men, he spoke again. "They've put him hinter the second empty berth." "Yes," I said. "Poor beggars." We reached the other men, and they opened out and allowed us to get near the door. Several of them asked in low tones whether Jacobs was all right, and I told them yes, not saying anything then about his condition. I got close up to the doorway and looked into the berth. The lamp was lit, and I could see plainly. There were 2 bunks in the place, and a man had been laid in each. The skipper was there, leaning up against a bulkhead. He looked worried, but was silent, seeming to be brooding in his own thoughts. The second mate was busy with a couple of flags, which he was spreading over the bodies. The first mate was talking, evidently telling him something, but his tone was so low that I caught his words only with difficulty. It struck me that he seemed pretty subdued. I got parts of his sentences in patches, as it were. "Broken," I heard him say, "and the Dutchman." "I've seen him," the second mate said shortly. "2 straight off the reel," said the mate. 3 in." The second made no reply. "Of course you know, accident," the first mate went on. "Is it?" the second said in a queer voice. I saw the mate glance at him in a doubtful sort of way, but the second was covering poor old Jock's dead face, and did not appear to notice his look. It, the mate said, and stopped. After a moment's hesitation, he said something further that I could not catch, but there seemed a lot of funk in his voice. The second mate appeared not to have heard him. At any rate, he made no reply, but bent and straightened out a corner of the flag over the rigid figure in the lower bunk. There was a certain niceness in his action which made me warm towards him. "He's white," I thought to myself. Out loud I said, "We've put Jacobs into his bunk, sir." The mate jumped, then whizzed round and stared at me as though I had been a ghost. The second mate turned also, but before he could speak, the skipper took a step towards me. "Is he all right?" he asked. "Well, sir," I said, "he's a bit queer, but I think it's possible he may be better after a sleep." "I hope so too," he replied, and stepped out on deck. He went towards the starboard poop ladder, walking slowly. The second went and stood by the lamp, and the mate, after a quick glance at him, came out and followed the skipper up onto the poop. It occurred to me then, like a flash, that the man had stumbled upon a portion of the truth. This accident came so soon after that other. It was evident that, in his mind, he had connected them. I recollected the fragments of his remarks to the second mate. Then those many minor happenings that had cropped up at different times, and at which he had sneered. I wondered whether he would begin to comprehend their significance, their beastly, sinister significance. "Ah, Mr. Bully Mate," I thought to myself, "you're in for a bad time if you've begun to understand." Abruptly, my thoughts jumped to the vague future before us. "God help us," I muttered. The second mate, after a look round, turned down the wick of the lamp and came out, closing the door after him. "Now, you men," he said to the mate's watch, "get forward. We can't do anything more. You'd better go and get some sleep." "Aye, aye, sir," they said in a chorus. Then, as we all turned to go forward, he asked if anyone had relieved the lookout. "No, sir," answered Quoin. "Is it yours?" second asked. "Yes, sir," he replied. "Hurry up and relieve him, then," the second said. "Aye, aye, sir," the man answered, and went forward with the rest of us. As we went, I asked Plummer who was at the wheel. "Tom," he said. As he spoke, several spots of rain fell, and I glanced up at the sky. It had become thickly clouded. "Looks as if it were going to breeze up," I said. "Yes," he replied. "We'll be shorting her down 'fore long." "Maybe an all-hands job," I remarked. "Yes," he answered again. "'Twon't be no use their turning in if it is." The man who was carrying the lantern went into the forecastle, and we followed. "Where's there one belonging to our side?" Plummer asked. "Got smashed upstairs," answered Stubbins. "How're that?" Plummer inquired. Stubbins hesitated. "The second mate dropped it," I replied. "The sail hit it or something." The men in the other watch seemed to have no immediate intention of turning in, but sat in their bunks and around on the chests. There was a general lighting of pipes, in the midst of which there came a sudden moan from one of the bunks in the fore part of the forecastle, a part that was always a bit gloomy, and was more so now, on account of our having only one lamp. "What's that?" asked one of the men belonging to the other side. "Shh," said Stubbins. "It's him." "Who?" inquired Plummer. "Jacobs?" "Yes," I replied. "Poor devil." "What were happening when you got up there?" asked the man on the other side, indicating with a jerk of his head the fore royal. Before I could reply, Stubbins jumped up from his sea-chest. "The second mate's whistling," he said. "Come on," and he ran out on deck. Plummer, Jaskett, and I followed quickly. Outside, it had started to rain pretty heavily. As we went, the second mate's voice came to us through the darkness. "Stand by the main royal clew-lines and bunt-lines," I heard him shout, and the next instant came the hollow thudder of the sail as he started to lower away. In a few minutes we had it hauled up. "Up and furl it, a couple of you," he sung out. I went towards the starboard rigging. Then I hesitated. No one else had moved. The second mate came among us. "Come on now, lads," he said. "Make a move. It's got to be done." "I'll go," I said, "if someone else will come." Still no one stirred, and no one answered. Tammy came across to me. "I'll come," he volunteered in a nervous voice. "No, by God, no," said the second mate abruptly. He jumped into the main rigging himself. "Come along, Jessup," he shouted. I followed him, but I was astonished. I had fully expected him to get onto the other fellow's tracks like a ton of bricks. It had not occurred to me that he was making allowances. I was simply puzzled then, but afterwards it dawned upon me. No sooner had I followed the second mate than straightway Stubbins, Plummer, and Jaskett came up after us at a run. About halfway to the maintop, the second mate stopped and looked down. "Who's that coming up below you, Jessup?" he asked. Before I could speak, Stubbins answered. "It's me, sir, and Plummer and Jaskett." "Who the devil told ye to come now? Go straight down, the lot of you." "We're coming up to keep your company, sir," was his reply. At that I was confident of a burst of temper from the second. And yet, for the second time within a couple of minutes, I was wrong. Instead of cursing Stubbins, he, after a moment's pause, went on up the rigging without another word, and the rest of us followed. We reached the Royal and made short work of it. Indeed, there were sufficient of us to have eaten it. When we had finished, I noticed that the second mate remained on the yard until we were all in the rigging. Evidently, he had determined to take a full share of any risk there might be, but I took care to keep pretty close to him, so as to be on hand if anything happened. Yet we reached the deck again without anything having occurred. I have said without anything having occurred, but I am not really correct in this. For as the second mate came down over the crosstrees, he gave a short, abrupt cry. "Anything wrong, sir?" I asked. "No," he said. "Nothing. I banged my knee." And yet now I believe he was lying. For that same watch I was to hear men giving just such cries, but God knows they had reason enough. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Hands That Plucked. Directly we reached the deck, the second mate gave the order. "Mizzen t'gallant clew-lines and bunt-lines," and led the way up onto the poop. He went and stood by the halyards, ready to lower away. As I walked across to the starboard clew-line, I saw that the old man was on deck, and as I took hold of the rope, I heard him sing out to the second mate. "Call all hands to shorten sail, Mr. Tulipson." "Very good, sir," the second mate replied. Then he raised his voice. "Go forward, you Jessup, and call all hands to shorten sail. You better give them a call in the boatswain's place as you go." "Aye, aye, sir," I sung out and hurried off. As I went, I heard him tell Tammy to go down and call the mate. Reaching the forecastle, I put my head in through the starboard doorway and found some of the men beginning to turn in. "It's all hands on deck, shorten sail," I sung out. I stepped inside. "Just what I said," grumbled one of the men. "They don't damn well think we're going aloft tonight after what's happened?" asked another. "We've been up to the main royal," I answered. "The second mate went with us." "What?" said the first man. "Their second mate hisself?" "Yes," I replied. "The whole blooming watch went up." "And what happened?" he asked. "Nothing," I said. "Nothing at all. We just made a mouthful apiece of it and came down again." "All the same," remarked the second man, "I don't fancy going upstairs after what's happened." "Well," I replied, "it's not a matter of fancy. We've got to get the sail off her, or there'll be a mess. One of the prentices told me the glass is falling." "Come along, boys, we've got to do it," said one of the older men, rising from a chest at this point. "What's it doing outside, mate?" "Raining," I said. "You'll want your oilskins." I hesitated a moment before going on deck again. From the bunk forward among the shadows I had seemed to hear a faint moan. "Poor beggar," I thought to myself. Then the old chap who had just spoken broke in upon my attention. "It's all right, mate," he said rather testily. "You needn't wait. We'll be out in a minute." "That's all right. I wasn't thinking about you lot," I replied, and walked forward to Jacobs's bunk. Some time before, he had rigged up a pair of curtains, cut out of an old sack to keep off the draught. These someone had drawn, so that I had to pull him aside to see him. He was lying on his back, breathing in a queer, jerky fashion. I could not see his face plainly, but it seemed rather pale in the half-light. "Jacobs," I said. "Jacobs, how do you feel now?" But he made no sign to show me that he had heard me, and so after a few moments I drew the curtains to again and left him. "What like does he seem?" asked one of the fellows as I went towards the door. "Bad," I said. "Damn bad. I think the steward ought to be told to come and have a look at him. I'll mention it to the second when I get a chance." I stepped out on deck and ran aft again to give them a hand with the sail. We got it hauled up and then went forward to the fore topgallant, and a minute later the other watch were out, and, with the mate, we were busy at the main. By the time the main was ready for making fast, we had the fore hauled up, so that now all three topgallants were in the ropes and ready for stowing. Then came the order, "Up aloft and furl!" "Up with you, lads," the second man said. "Don't let's have any hanging back this time." Away aft by the main, the men in the mate's watch seemed to be standing in a clump by the mast, but it was too dark to see clearly. I heard the mate start to curse. Then there came a growl, and he shut up. "Be handy, men, be handy," the second mate sung out. At that, Stubbins jumped into the rigging. "Come on," he shouted. "We'll have their bloomin' sail fast and down on deck again before they're started." Plummer followed, then Jasket, I, and Coyne, who had been called down off the lookout to give a hand. "That's the style, lads," the second sung out encouragingly. Then he ran aft to the mate's crowd. I heard him and the mate talking to the men, and presently, when we were going over the foretop, I made out that they were beginning to get into the rigging. I found out afterwards that as soon as the second mate had seen them off the deck, he went up to the mizzen topgallant along with the four prentices. On our part, we made our way slowly aloft, keeping one hand for ourselves and the other for the ship, as you can fancy. In this manner we had gone as far as the crosstrees, at least Stubbins, who was first, had, when all at once he gave out just another such cry as had the second mate a little earlier, only that in his case he followed it by turning round and blasting Plummer. "You might have blarsted well sent me flying down on deck," he shouted. "If you bloody well think it's a joke, try it on someone else." "It wasn't me," interrupted Plummer. "I haven't touched you. Who the hell are you swearing at?" "At you," I heard him reply, but what more he might have said was lost in a loud shout from Plummer. "What's up, Plummer?" I sung out. "For God's sake, you two, don't get fighting up aloft." But a loud, frightened curse was all the answer he gave. Then, straightway, he began to shout at the top of his voice, and in the lows of his noise I caught the voice of Stubbins cursing savagely. "They'll come down with a run," I shouted helplessly. "They'll come down as sure as nuts." I caught Jasket by the boot. "What are they doing? What are they doing?" I sung out. "Can't you see?" I shook his leg as I spoke, but at my touch the old idiot, as I thought him at the moment, began to shout in a frightened voice, "Oh, oh, help, help!" "Shut up," I bellowed. "Shut up, you old fool. If you won't do anything, let me get past you." Yet he only cried out the more, and then abruptly I caught the sound of a frightened clamour of men's voices, away down somewhere about the maintop. Curses, cries of fear, even shrieks, and above it all, someone shouting to go down on deck. "Get down! Get down! 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 Blarst!" The rest was drowned in a fresh outburst of hoarse crying in the night. I tried to get past old Jasket, but he was clinging to the rigging. Sprawled onto it is the best way to describe his attitude, so much of it as I could see in the darkness. Up above him, Stubbins and Plummer still shouted and cursed, and the shrouds quivered and shook as though the two were fighting desperately. Stubbins seemed to be shouting something definite, but whatever it was I could not catch. At my helplessness I grew angry and shook and prodded Jasket to make him move. "Damn you, Jasket!" I roared. "Damn you for a funky old fool! Let me get past! Let me get past, will you?" But instead of letting me pass, I found that he was beginning to make his way down. At that I caught him by the slack of his trousers near the stern with my right hand, and with the other I got hold of the after shroud somewhere above his left hip. By these means I fairly hoisted myself up onto the fellow's back. Then with my right I could reach to the forward shroud over his right shoulder, and having got a grip, I shifted my left to a level with it. At the same moment I was able to get my foot onto the splice of a ratline and so give myself a further lift. Then I paused an instant and glanced up. "Stubbins! Stubbins!" I shouted. "Plummer! Plummer!" But even as I called, Plummer's foot, reaching down through the gloom, alighted full on my upturned face. I let go from the rigging with my right hand and struck furiously at his leg, cursing him for his clumsiness. He lifted his foot, and in the same instant a sentence from Stubbins floated down to me, with a strange distinctness. "For God's sake, tell him to get down on deck!" he was shouting. Even as the words came to me, something in the darkness gripped my waist. I made a desperate clutch at the rigging with my disengaged right hand, and it was well for me that I secured the hold so quickly, for the same instant I was wrenched at with a brutal ferocity that appalled me. I said nothing, but lashed out into the night with my left foot. It is queer, but I cannot say with certainty that I struck anything. I was too downright desperate with funk to be sure, and yet it seemed to me that my foot encountered something soft that gave under the blow. It may have been nothing more than an imagined sensation, yet I am inclined to think otherwise, for instantly the hold about my waist was released, and I commenced to scramble down, clutching the shrouds pretty desperately. I have only a very uncertain remembrance of that which followed. Whether I slid over Jasket, or whether he gave way to me, I cannot tell. I know only that I reached the deck in a blind whirl of fear and excitement, and the next thing I remember, I was among a crowd of shouting, half-mad sailormen. End of Chapter 10.